It is high time to correct some misconceptions about early violin making. The idea that the first violins were made in Italy, and that outside Brescia and Cremona violin making was virtually non-existent before 1600, must definitely be dispelled. Representations in art, archival texts, and the study of a number of extant instruments show that violin makers in various places in Europe supplied the local markets with instruments, in a style and with techniques that were once common and that are now gradually being rediscovered. These features can be summarized as follows. First of all, the elongated shape of the corners is due to the archaic technique of gluing the ribs together without corner blocks. Secondly, the ribs were glued directly onto the back, or sometimes into a groove along the edges of the back, without the use of any mold. Also, the bass bar was cut out of the spruce block for the top, and not glued on separately. The sound holes have large notches in the middle and sharp corners near the upper and lower circles, so no straight cut at the extremities of the wings. Typically, the circles have identical diameters. The pegs are sickle-shaped and the bridges generally stand close to the tailpiece and not between the indents of the sound holes. And last but not least, the neck and top block are made from a single block of wood, making the size of the heel unimportant. To accept these new findings, we have to move away from the idea of Cremonese violin-making techniques and style as the sole standard from the very beginning for correct violin-making principles. Amid the existing archaic traditions, Cremonese makers developed a refined style and at the same time introduced lute-making techniques, such as wooden linings, more blocks glued in, bass bars glued on separately, the use of a mold, and neck joints reinforced with metal nails. Also, we need to abandon an old but persistent myth that initially Cremona and Brescia had monopolized the manufacture of the violin, and that this monopoly began to disappear by the second half of the 17th century. In fact, exactly the opposite happened. Cremonese lutherie had entered an environment where violins were already being made in a different way, and only started to prevail after the 1648 treaties, when economic and cultural exchanges with the north became easier, and when the popularity of Italian violin music began to grow. In fact, the violins ascribed to Andrea Amati are all dated after the first iconographic and archival testimonies of archaic violin making. We didn't realize this until recently for a number of reasons. Distrust in the documentary value of works of art is one, and is widespread among makers and scholars who still believe that extant instruments are more reliable sources when it comes to studying the early history of violin making. The few surviving instruments from before the mid-17th century have often been tarnished by alterations and forgeries in an attempt to fit them into the Procrustean bed of classical Italian lutherie. In contrast, depictions of violins in art are not normally subject to alteration and are often very realistic, sometimes even showing the instruments from several different angles. They can be studied in detail and recurring characteristics can be recognized, allowing present-time instrument makers to realize material reconstructions of the newly discovered archaic violin-making traditions.